Justin, thank you so much for being here. Truly is an honor. I am a long time fan.
Oh, bless you. Well, it's lovely to meet you, Dakota.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for coming in my direction to
Totally.
record this.
It's the least I could do. I mean, I know how busy you are, and you have your schedule is just so slammed, so it's the least I could do just to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I feel like this conversation is directed at people like me, my story, people who kind of grew up in a culture of Christianity and have walked away. And I think you've just done such a brilliant job at having these conversations and really doing a biopsy on culture and how that impacts our faith and why people have walked away. And for those who are listening, I mean, can you talk about your book, The Surprising Rebirth
of Belief
in God?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a book I wrote a couple of years ago now. But it was really looking back at nearly 20 years of conversations I'd been hosting between Christians and atheists, and just the way in which those conversations had changed over time. So I began hosting debates on faith for a radio station and it became a podcast, video show. But it was very much began in the heyday of what's sometimes called New Atheism.
Yeah.
This very sort of dogmatic, quite aggressive form of atheism, claiming not only did God not exist, but religion is bad for you.
Yeah.
And, it was quite out there. It was very public. It was very popular. We had here in London the atheist bus campaign, which saw these kind of red London buses bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So it was quite an evangelistic form of atheism.
Which is the first of its kind.
In some ways, yeah. I mean, atheism's, been around for a long time, but it's tended to reside more in academic kind of conversations and so on. This was a much more sort of public form of atheism. But it was also great for these conversations that I began hosting because it kind of put the God question back in the public conversation. And in some ways, the direction that the UK had gone in and the West generally had been kind of sliding towards a kind of agnostic apathy around God, really. But at least the New Atheists kind of very much asked interesting questions about God, even if I disagreed with their conclusions. So I ended up having a lot of those kinds of characters on the show to discuss and debate their objections to God and faith with, good quality Christian thinkers. So that was kind of how the show began. And it was real fun. And in the end, I discovered there are some really good reasons to believe in God. Actually, there's some really good answers to those atheist objections. But I also noticed the conversations did change quite dramatically. So maybe sort of 10, 15 years in, I started to realize actually the new atheism itself had kind of waned. It sort of run out of steam for various reasons. And I started to notice that a new conversation taking its place, still often secular thinkers, but who were way more open to the value of Christianity. They weren't dismissing it and saying it's evil or it's terrible for us. In fact, a lot of them were saying, I'm not sure we can live without something like Christian faith.
Like Tom Holland before.
Like Tom Holland, yeah. So Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, by the way.
Yes.
Just have to put that caveat in every time. But Tom Holland, he's become a very well-known historian here in the UK. Written best-selling books on the Greco-Roman world. But in 2019, he wrote this extraordinary book, Dominion, subtitled The Making of the Western Mind. And it's really his thesis for the way in which actually he came to realize as a sort of secular historian that Christianity had completely shaped the kind of moral imagination of the West. And there's just a really interesting, personal dimension to his story. I've had the privilege of interviewing Tom various points over the last few years. And he really went on a kind of personal journey, having not really had a faith himself, or whatever faith he had sort of had sputtered out by his teenage years. But, went on to this very successful career writing works of popular history about the Greco-Roman world. But he says the longer he spent time in the sandals, as it were, of the Greeks and the Romans, the more he realized just how alien their worldview was to his own as a modern 21st century liberal Westerner. Because this was a world where, the lives of women and children were cheap, where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, absolutely assumed and unquestioned, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. A senior Roman male could have his pick of any man, woman, boy or child who was his social inferior. And he started to ask, well, why do I believe in equality, dignity, compassion, freedom, progress, these kinds of values that obviously weren't instinctive to the Greeks and the Romans. So he realized he didn't get those values from the Greeks and the Romans. And he realized he didn't really get them from sort of atheism or science either. Those are sort of value neutral projects.
Yeah.
He came to the realization he got them from a very specific place, and that was Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And the movement he began 2,000 years ago had completely, if you like, reshaped the world Tom Holland now found himself in. Even as someone who didn't necessarily believe in the supernatural claims of Christianity,
Totally.
he still nevertheless said to me in these interviews, I realized that in almost every other way, I'm a Christian, because that worldview has so shaped the way I think about what it means to be human. So I just started running into more and more of these secular thinkers who were kind of starting to act a lot more sympathetic towards Christian faith than these new atheist figures had before.
No, and that's what I actually really love about Tom Holland's book Dominion is a lot of in the modern secular worldview, in secularism, the way Charles Taylor would define it, which is, the sovereignty of self, is we often have bought into the culture that progression or liberation and standing up for the oppressed and taking care of the poor is progressive worldviews. And so I think when people who were atheist read that book, probably were quite surprised to that realization, correct? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think the way that Tom Holland puts it is that we sort of are like goldfish swimming in a goldfish bowl, but they don't realize the water they're swimming in. They just absolutely take it for granted. And I think Tom Holland says it's like that with our assumptions about morality and human value.
Yeah.
A lot of secular progressive people just assume, well, this is just common sense. This is just the way things are. Of course, we believe in human rights, in human value, human dignity. But Tom Holland's kind of there asking awkward questions and saying, well, where did you get those beliefs in the first place? Because as he said, they didn't come from ancient Greece or Rome.
Yeah.
They don't seem to come out of science or reason. And I think what he's pointed out is that even sort of secular humanist versions of morality, today, essentially are still quasi-Christian at heart.
Yeah.
And you kind of can't avoid the fact that that's where they go back to.
Totally.
And the other awkward question he's asking is, well, what happens as we lose the Christian story in the West? Can we hold on to the fruits, if you like, of the Christian revolution without the roots? Because there are other worldviews out there, that are competing for people's hearts and minds.
And partly compelling in some ways.
And indeed. And I think that's partly why Tom Holland, felt compelled to write the book.
Yeah.
Is because he was starting to realize, actually, there's lots of other ways that people have conceived of what it means to be human.
Sure.
You have Putin's Russia, you have communist China, you have fundamentalist Islam. There's lots of other kind of competing ideologies out there. What's special about this kind of Western Christian view of morality, and can you hold on to it if you no longer kind of have the story that it's at its heart?
Totally. And I think, so for a lot of people who are, Tom Holland, academics seem to be wrestling with these conversations on a bigger picture, probably more constant. But by the time the secular narrative has kind of trickled down into modern society, can you talk about some of the effects of what we've seen in that Charles Taylor world, right? Because by the time Tom Holland's figuring out a lot of the cultural values that we're seeing are actually rooted in Christianity, the day-to-day person probably isn't reading Tom Holland's Dominion.
No. Or the Bible.
And so at this point, they've already thrown out Christianity. Yeah. Christianity isn't viewed as the solution to the problem, but Christianity is viewed as the source of the problem.
Yeah, in many ways it has been, and I think that's partly because people have become so ignorant, or they've simply forgotten, not been taught the way in which actually Christianity gave them the very values by which they often judge Christianity, ironically. I think, for me, I would say there's been kind of from the Enlightenment onwards almost a sort of this rationalizing, scientific kind of way of looking at life. And to some extent, that has been what has, in most people's minds, replaced God and the need for faith. It is the idea that we can make sense of life purely on our own terms. And it stops being about us kind of a collective kind of account of reality that we might share, and more about our own individual ways in which we decide to become the sort of the locus of our own experience and so on. In a sense, that's, religion. If you just go to the actual meaning of the word religio, it's about holding people together in a story that kind of makes sense of for a lot of people. I think we've lost that. We've lost, in a sense, over the last couple of centuries, a sense of a common story that binds us together.
Sure.
And I think that's where you get the Charles Taylor thing, about the modern secular self, is kind of a lot more of this kind of sort of sees themselves as not joined with other people in the same way that we're kind of our own individual entities.
It's giving everyone autonomy of self.
Yeah,
and
exactly. Autonomy. That's a good way of putting it.
Now you're responsible of writing your origin story. You're now responsible of writing your telos. You're now responsible for cultivating your own reality. And I mean, ultimately, right, in the secular narrative, it's like anything goes as long as your truth isn't really hindering mine.
Yeah.
And then can you dive into that? Like, how has that essentially fragmented our culture?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're living in the effects of some of that reality. And I think the church has kind of responded pretty hostile against that worldview, where it's like, sometimes I think in the church, we've kind of come to convince ourselves that Jesus is up in the throne room, like, oh my gosh, secularism. Like, I conquered Rome, I conquered death, I conquered the grave, but now secularism is this, like, right? You get that sense often, and I get it. It's good to like do a cultural diagnosis and equip the church and how to navigate it. But sometimes I felt like there was this radical empowerment towards secularism that caused a lot of fear in the church. Yeah, that caused us to abstain from culture. And versus actually
to withdraw,
participating in and bringing a cultural renewal. I mean,
I think that's right. And I think the issue is, I think what we need to understand is that everyone has a worldview in the end. Everyone has a way of coming to see the world through a particular way of seeing it. And that's true of secularists as much as it is of Muslims, Hindus, Jewish people, Christians. So there's a guiding philosophy somewhere behind that. And that's what needs to be interrogated. And there's a sense in which if the church just sort of withdraws to a kind of holy huddle and says, we're just going to let culture go wherever, in terms of the secular direction, and doesn't come and present its own vision of reality, then it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It has to kind of present something, the good, the true, the beautiful, to a story which is kind of...
Or beautiful, good and true.
Put it that way around. But it's a story because in a funny way, all of those other stories have bits of the Christian story. I think they're often echoes of it within it. And that's true of secularism. They're kind of the importance that, the average secular humanist might put on the intrinsic sort of value of each person, but that's kind of mediated by simply not doing harm to other people and so on.
And you see that in John 1. I mean, it just John using the word logos there. Yeah. I mean, it's so profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can get to a Christian, that's come from somewhere. I think there's a kind of a Christian root to that, but it's often divorced from the other aspects of Christian morality, which are also about our duties towards one another and the way in which we're not supposed to see each other as just these, purely autonomous individuals with our own rights that which don't have any can't be superseded by anybody else's. So I mean the way I put it in the book though is I use a slightly different metaphor than Charles Taylor's. I talk about the idea of a story that we need, that we're kind of story making creatures.
I love that.
And so this is kind of something that psychologists like Jonathan Cottrell talk a lot about, this idea that if humans don't have a story that makes sense of their life, then if they feel they're just bouncing around chaotically without any kind of guiding purpose or narrative in their life, it leads to very bad sort of mental health outcomes, social outcomes. And I think we are kind of have got to that point in our culture because the story that once did, as it were, shape the kind of the boundaries, if you like, for most people's lives was the Christian story. And that was a story, like all good stories, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Or could we even say actually that even at least a deistic story?
Yeah.
I think when you look at like the scriptures in the Old Testament, not everyone believed in Yahweh, the one God, but they believed, they at least had there is a transcendent, we are held to something.
Yeah,
would you
absolutely.
say that is?
Yes, so generally speaking, there's definitely been a kind of a transcendent story. I'd say more specific though, it's limiting ourselves just to the kind of the West, the Christian West, modern Christian civilization. The guiding story there has been the Christian story specifically, and that, as I say, is a story where it begins with God creating humans in His image, male and female. That gives kind of everyone infinite value and worth. The middle of this story is God comes in person to live that life with us. And even though life is hard and so on, Christ shows us a way in which through his death and resurrection, we have this eternal hope and purpose. And in some way or another, that story has kind of been the guiding story. Now, it's always often been lived out very imperfectly in the lives of people and institutions in the church over the last 2,000 years. But nonetheless, that's been the kind of the fundamental story that sort of has created a kind of a joint sort of way of understanding life together.
Yeah.
Now, in the last couple of 100 years, that story has increasingly obviously been sidelined. And the problem is that the new atheists, I think, thought, well, we don't need a story to live by. We've got science and reason kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a non-story, because if there's anything to that, it's that there isn't any ultimate purpose to life. There's no overarching kind of meaning. You kind of have to make it up for yourself kind of thing. But I think that's really hard for people to live by. They need something that looks a bit more like the God story to make sense of their life. And so what's happened in the absence of the Christian story is not that science and reason and this new atheist utopia, that hasn't come to dominate things. What we've ended up with is all kinds of other kind of quasi-spiritual stories that have come to dominate. And there's a huge plethora of them. And it may be sort of stories on the progressive left around gender, identity, sexuality. It might be the political right, mythologies around, conspiracy theories, political figures, whatever. But all of them kind of serve the purpose, I think. It's people trying to find a story to make sense of their life that kind of has that same sacred value that the God story once had.
That's good.
And but the problem, of course, is that there's so many of these stories and they're all so different. They'll bash up against each other.
Now it's a war of ideology.
And it's a war of ideologies. It's the culture war. It's the clash. And we end up with a culture that is absolutely exhausted by trying to kind of curate all these different ways of understanding ourselves by the kind of the turbocharging of all of this by social media and everything else. And I just think it's kind of got to the point where people are actually feeling depressed, anxious. We've seen the skyrocketing mental health rates, among young people. And I think it's underneath it, it's this search for identity, meaning and purpose, but we don't have a story any longer that makes sense of us. And so for me, that's why there's now a kind of an openness, interestingly, to people hearing the original story again. It's almost like out of desperation, we've got to the place
where we threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we need to listen to this old story again. And people like, as I say, Tom Holland have kind of been reminding their secular peers, the story kind of actually turns out was foundational to most of the things we believe.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's time to reinvestigate it.
I do think it's interesting that you said that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm stretching too far with this. But from what I heard you just say right here is, okay, once we removed the unifying story, you can trace that even back to the Enlightenment, the removal of God. And then all of a sudden, fast forward to 1960s, the sexual revolution, right? What God is now removed. Now there's boundary, like there's a removal of what was maybe a hindrance or a moral or an ethic and how to live, the accountability to a higher power. Then you see this sexual revolution happens and autonomy breaks out. And then all of a sudden marriage becomes questionable. Then all of a sudden gender becomes questionable. Now we're even moving into a time of transhumanism, which is what is even a human? Would you say that all of that is almost a domino effect?
Yeah, I'd say.
Would you say are they kind of? I think as linear as
it's not maybe that linear, but it's all downstream. I think of essentially that beginning move of taking God out of the equation, because once you take God out, and by definition, God sort of provides a grounding, a kind of an objectiveness to reality. There's a kind of givenness to things if God is kind of created and ordained things. If we're living in the world of the kind of Enlightenment atheism, where we essentially become the locus of reality and everything becomes essentially subjective, we can shape and mold reality as we see fit if there's no givenness to the universe or to our place in the universe. And I think that is where you do start to see a lot of those institutions start to unravel at that point. And so, the sexual revolution was partly obviously a technological thing, the pill and everything made it possible to have sex, in ways that didn't have the consequences of the previous generations. But at the same time, I think it was also the fact that the very idea of there being a givenness to the way in which, sexual relationships should happen, what their purpose is in terms of procreation, children, everything, that was all being questioned and broken down. And inevitably, you then, other aspects of human reality start to get questioned and broken down. It's really interesting though, isn't it, that, in theory, this was in service of freedom, and very much that sense of autonomous freedom. I can do what I like as long as I'm not hurting other people.
It's almost First Corinthian language all over again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then you look at the culture sort of, 70 plus years on from that sexual revolution now, and you realize people really aren't any happier. There's all kinds of aspects of society which have taken a real plunge because of the sexual liberation thing. People aren't having actually any more sex now than they used to, ironically, because we've kind of begun to replace it with
watered down.
It's watered down, or it's turned into online pornography, or whatever it is. So there's a kind of people are certainly no more satisfied, probably a lot less satisfied, I would argue, today in terms of all of that stuff than they were pre-sexual revolution, and so you've got to ask yourself what happened, and it's. G.K. Chesterton has had this sort of story that he told about, someone wandering through a field comes to a fence and that's dividing two places, and he says, I can't see any purpose for this fence. I'll knock it down. They knock it down, only to discover later that was enclosing a bull, in the field. And his point is, you may not understand what these sort of barriers that we've created, you may come to think they seem fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned and whatever. It might turn out they're there for a good reason that you haven't fully worked out. And I do get the sense that we're just starting to realize in modern culture, it turns out some of these funny old-fashioned ideas like monogamous marriage and that kind of thing might have had a value after all that we didn't quite realize, because when you take it away, it turns out it's a lot harder to hold a lot of things together.
I do find it interesting because we ultimately, even in the atheist or worldview, actually with every even religious worldview and even with the secular worldview, you ultimately return back to what you deem as your creator, right? I mean, let's just say atheistic worldview, traditional atheistic worldview is there's nothing. Okay, if we come from nothing, ultimately you're going to return back to nothing. Religions like Hindu, Buddhism, there's not really a deity, a God figure, right? It's about becoming nothing, and you return back to nothing. At least Islam and Judaism is a God, and the purpose is to restore back to that God. But even in the secular story, it's moral grounds are now subjected and fragmented, and ultimately what ends up happening to our lives, we become fragmented and completely disembodied and return back to the same belief system in which we have. So it is in some weird way that how do we diagnose that in ourselves and our own belief systems, I guess? Like, how do we look inward and think, what is my worldview? What does my belief system lead me to? Because I think now you're right. You're starting to see this massive move back to the Christian story. But how do we not fall into the same trap of spiritual syncretism?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's lots of different directions this could go in. And my book, and podcast series is titled "The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God," and I think that is happening. But there's all kinds of versions of spirituality and that kind of thing that this could bring back in. Again, one of the images I use in the book and podcast series is drawn from a famous poem by Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet, called Dover Beach, and he, 150 years ago, had this line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, that faith has kind of gone out on the tide to be replaced by, secularism and science and technology. And my point in the book is that actually the sea of faith could come back in again. That's the way the sea works. It goes out, but it comes back in again on the tide. And I think we're at one of those turning of the tide moments. People are kind of realizing they need a story that's bigger than secular materialism to ground what they are. But the question is, what story is that going to be? because lots of the tide could bring back in a lot of different flotsam and jetsam, you know. And so you are seeing the rise of, you know, especially among younger generations, Gen Z, sort of a huge amount of spiritual openness, but to all kinds of things, you know, crystals, manifesting, the occult, tarot.
There's a little bit of Jesus in there too.
Yeah, often with a little bit of Jesus sprinkled on in a kind of pick and mix sort of fashion. You know, Jesus consciousness is quite popular in online circles, and I suppose it's that question of sort of, and you know, there may equally be other religious sort of positions and trends that are kind of starting to gain ground as well as people look for stability and meaning and that kind of thing. I've seen a lot of, you know, young men take a real interest in Islam because it's kind of gives them a sense, you know, if they're feeling lost and rootless, you know, Islam can be quite strict in a kind of way that's quite attractive to young men. It gives a structure, a kind of sense of meaning and purpose. There's lots of kind of competing kind of ideas in that sense. And I suppose the question is, what you know, will Christianity be the one that ultimately people come back to? Now, for me, one thing that Christianity's got going in its favor here in the West is that it's still the kind of foundational story. It's still the operating system, if you like, on which a lot of our cultural assumptions still function. Islam is attractive in some ways, but it's still, it's not the story that we started with in the West, if you like. It's come in sort of at the side, if you like, and it's a competitor, but it's not sort of the grounding assumption. It doesn't
hold a historical
it doesn't have that kind of same sense in which if you're just someone who just thinks, look, I just want to work out what life is about, I want to get in touch with God, you're more likely to go to your local parish church here in the UK, because that's the natural kind of sort of place, in which you're gonna look for that. So I think Christianity is still got enough, if you like, in the tank, that people are sort of finding their way back to it. And I think with the more New Age stuff, that tends to be driven, I find, really by a kind of an online thing. It's a kind of a trend or whatever online. I think it's harder to make that work IRL in real life. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
because
totally.
Again, one of the big advantages of Christianity in the church is it's one of the few places where you can still get together on a week-to-week basis in person and kind of try and work this out together.
Yeah.
That kind of community, I think, is harder to find in other sort of more New Age spiritual traditions, which again are a lot more kind of me-centered rather than community, like we're going to do this together as a community.
I think that's what I'm also still seeing is we've come to believe that the secular narrative, the secular story has failed, essentially. The secularism, again, defined by Charles Taylor. But yet there is still this individual focus on manifesting or in trying to work the universe into your sort of favor and trying to manipulate the cosmos into your bend. And sometimes what I've been seeing and what I've been hearing is, okay, if I just love God and love my neighbor well, somehow it'll strong harm God into...
Yeah, and there's always going to be that danger. I think there are manifestations of Christianity that are, again, kind of just the self-help therapeutic deism version, which is kind of... So yeah, absolutely. I think that is a huge danger. So when my hope is when people find their way to Christian faith, they find their way to the real deal and not to a kind of sort of self-help prosperity gospel or kind of I'm just using this to kind of become my best self or whatever it is.
So as a historian, philosopher, I don't know how you define yourself in those ways, but how do we have a modern take on like the Church of Acts? Because you see, they were teaching essentially the resurrection of God. Something significant happened at a point in history. They also went back to the story of the origin of the earth, that in the very beginning, right? You see a lot of the long speeches. They go back to God created this world, that there is a God and that God resurrected. And you see a radical sense of community. And I think you see a huge sense of power.
Yeah.
And so I guess, how do we move that into a modern shift? Like, how do we...
I think Acts is actually the book for our moment. And funnily enough, just to the church where we're filming this, we've been going through the book of Acts just recently, because there's so much in there that is just so perfect for our post-Christian age. But almost, you could almost describe what we're living through as a pre-Christian age. You know, Acts was a pre-Christian moment. This was when this was just a tiny, really relatively tiny group of people who were starting to bring this message of Jesus to the Mediterranean world. And in that sense, you know, all around them was paganism and all the assumptions that it had. And we often, obviously it went on to become, you know, Christianity went on to become the dominant story in Western civilization. But at that point, it's just this strange, weird story about a dying and rising God and everything else. And yet when you see the way that those evangelists, Paul especially obviously, took that message and the way he presented it to the philosophers in Greece, the Stoics, you know, I think Acts 17 is maybe kind of one of the best examples of how we should kind of adopt the same principles. Because Paul, what's really significant for me in that is that Paul didn't kind of go in railing against the idolatry. He was offended by the idolatry of Greece. And he could have gone in and just sort of whacked them over the head. But he didn't. He kind of went in and tried to...
He spoke their language.
He spoke their language. He tried to find these cultural touch points and said, I've been looking around at all your idols, and I noticed this one to an unknown God. Well, I've come to tell you about the unknown God, the God you've been looking for. And he also quotes their own poets and philosophers. And he's just... The way in which he kind of graciously seeks to connect with the culture that already exists there, but to show how what they've been looking for all along is actually found in the Christian story, in the person of Christ. I think that's kind of where we need to adopt the same kind of thing, not to kind of throw our hands up in horror at people, you know, manifesting or looking into witchcraft or whatever it is in the kind of, as I say, we're returning to an almost pagan, you know, way of looking at life. And as you said, the kind of the instinct people have to want to kind of control it, which is essentially what magic is. It's the trying to control the forces of nature through your personal, you know, preference. And that's not what Christianity obviously is. Christianity is submitting yourself to the Creator and working with Him and alongside Him to see what He wants to do and to kind of align yourself through the Spirit with Him. And that's and so, but let's not kind of like berate the people who are in that place, because as Paul said, you know, the God you're looking for is not very far away. I think they're all looking for God. And God is actually closer than they think. And the openness that I'm seeing, especially, I think it's actually easy. This is why I'm excited about this moment, is that it was hard work when it was the dry ground of secular atheism. You kind of had to work so hard even to get God a hearing, kind of thing. Now, you know, Gen Z, they're way less likely to be atheists than their parents or grandparents. That's what the polls are telling us. They've got this openness. They're looking for God, actually. Now, they might be looking in the wrong places, but if someone's hungry looking, then I think you've just got such an interesting opening, as Paul had, kind of to actually say, actually something might be happening here.
The God that you're looking for.
And likewise, you know, and then obviously Acts is just the story of all these communities being planted at every point. You know, lots of people rejected the message, weren't interested, made fun of them. But Paul always left a small group of believers. And from that, and that's the other significant thing. It's like you can start, sometimes it feels like just small pockets, but those pockets can make a huge difference, actually. And I just get the sense that having been a narrative of decline up to now, I feel like we've kind of reached our that kind of low point. And now every pocket I see of Christian community has this huge potential, actually. And that's why I'm excited about it.
So what would you say, if you had to like define it in a mission statement, like what was beautiful about the Acts Church? Because I mean, you know, we made a little cheeky comment about the podcast name of Beautiful, Good, and True, but I do think I mean, you see Aristotle and Plato talk about that. To live a virtuous life, you need a life that is good, true, and beautiful. And I think so much in our culture today, people are fighting over what is good and what is true, but no one's really fighting over what is beautiful. So beauty has kind of been left behind to the side. And not only that, but we went from a post-truth world with the Charles Taylor framework to now what I think you're seeing as well, a post-trust world. Why should I trust you?
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of the major questions that pastors are getting isn't, what is your stance on homosexuality? What is your stance on women in ministry? What is your stance? It's like, why can I trust you? And so ultimately in a post-trust age and in an age that goodness is questioned, how do we present Jesus through the lens of beauty? Like, what is a beautiful lens? Because I think beauty could be a real conduit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the age of AI and social media and digital media is making that trust question even harder. Because,
Sure.
you know, we can't even trust that we're talking to a human being these days.
Honestly.
It's kind of like everything's kind of, you know, skepticism kind of reigns in that sense. But at the same time, yeah, I get it's almost because of that, because everything is feeling like it's so hard to know what is true.
Sure.
It's sort of ignited a kind of a real need, a kind of search for truth, actually, in a lot of people's hearts. But I think that truth, like you say, it can't be divorced from beauty and goodness. You know, it's like there is this trio there. And people often recognize truth through beauty.
Yeah.
It's because it speaks to our heart, not just to our head. And I think a lot of people are sort of waking up to the fact that we have to experience truth in that kind of emotional way.
Yeah.
A kind of, you know, emotional intelligence as well as, you know, head intelligence. And so I think, you know, and partly I think because in lots of parts of culture we've moved to a very ugly kind of sort of, you know, you look at the buildings we build today that, you know, we throw them up. Sure. They're very utilitarian, and we know we're going to be tearing them down in 20 or 30 years. It's like it's this impermanence and ugliness of a world we're creating for ourselves. And yet people with far inferior technology, resources, you know, 1,000 years ago made these cathedrals that are still across the landscape of Europe. And they built them knowing they would never see the finished product, but they built them for something bigger. Part of the reason that
you're saying is actually why the roots of Christianity is able to come back around this time is because of the beauty that they
because of the beauty they left behind in the process of doing it. And there was always this vision, absolutely, of beauty was, it was important, you know, that the fact that by far all of the greatest works of literature, art and poetry are fundamentally Christian in their basis. There was something about the Christian message that inspired this beauty, this aesthetic. They wanted to kind of make it beautiful because what it was talking about was beautiful.
Sure.
And I think there's something about that the church needs to recognize. The danger is the church kind of has bought into a kind of utilitarian, kind of rationalistic way of kind of trying to present the gospel as just we just need to get people across the line, you know, sign the dotted line. It doesn't really matter, kind of
say the Roman send prayer and you're good.
Yeah. But then we kind of often fail to appeal to the whole person in doing that, because actually people are more than just a kind of, you know, give me the logic and I'll sign on the dotted line. They need to kind of feel the beauty of why this matters and why it speaks to their soul. And so I think the task of the church is to re-engage the imagination as much as the intellect at this point. Yeah. And that is going to be through art and literature and music and really good quality, and not story. Just kind of, and story. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think we're at a moment where there's a search for that. People are looking for something that's better than AI slop, basically. Sure. And the church has an opportunity. And I think and again, I think it's part of the AI thing, is they're going to be looking for the authenticity of that in human community and relationships. I think one of the most beautiful things the church can offer people is that genuine community. That's the kind of, there's something beautiful. It's difficult as well. Sure. It's harder when you're having to rub alongside people who are annoying and complex and flawed. But there's something very beautiful that can come out of that. And for me, that's, again, one of the reasons why I think we are seeing an attraction in that way. Have you
heard of Dr. John Deloney? He's in the West, he is a psychologist, therapist who wrote a book called Building a Non-Anxious Life. But essentially I was talking to him and he was saying how AI can do everything better than you except one thing. He said it can exegete Greek better than you. He can write a sermon better than you. He can write a paper better than you. He can name whatever it is, but he can't show up in person.
True.
Can't show up in person.
Yeah.
And I think in our day and age where we've kind of become ultimately what C.S. Lewis predicted, an abolition of man, we become men without chests. We become either so rational or so desire driven. And both of those things are actually really good when they're used together, right? I mean, I think I'll quote John Lennox from your podcast. It was, an eagle needs 2 wings to fly. And I think you need desire and the intellect for faith. And what I think you're describing is, how do you restore the chest?
Yeah.
The place that connects the two together.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, as you're looking at culture, you're talking with people, you're pastoring, but also speaking, like, how do you restore the chests of people?
I think you know, going, it is back to Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. He saw, as you say, that it was the kind of trying to pretend that objective beauty, morality, truth doesn't exist, that it's all purely subjective. That is when you kind of then eliminate the human, because you can just then reorder reality in what it means to be human in whatever picture you want to make it look like. And you've effectively abolished the idea of humanity. But God came in person. He came as a human. That is the absolute center of the Christian story, the incarnation. So there's something very profoundly important about being human. Yeah. And all of the limitations that has, but all of the kind of the ways in which that humanity has been the locus for creativity, art, you know, science, mathematics, you know, consciousness itself. There's something about us that is hugely important. So I think what we need to be redirecting people towards, and this will redirect them towards God and Christianity, but is to what it is to be human. You know, that's really good. That's the kind of thing. And that's what a lot of people are asking of themselves today. You know, what is my purpose as a human being? Does it mean to be human? You know, people are, you know, asking all kinds of questions about whether we can essentially choose our own version of identity when it comes to being human. But I think ultimately what you end up doing is, every time you kind of try and step outside of the kind of the givenness of what it is to be human, you end up kind of running into dead ends and difficulties. And so at that point, I just want to kind of, you know, the thing we can hold out to people is to say, you are a human. That does come with all kinds of restrictions and so on, but it comes with all kinds of possibility. Yeah. And there is a story about God becoming human, and the way in which in his humanity, he kind of gave us this model of what it is to be truly human. Yeah. And there's a way in which when you join your life to his life, it radically changes the way you think about yourself, the world, and what it means to be human in the process.
So as we kind of land this plane, I mean, I love what you just said. I mean, because I think even it's making me think a bit, okay, what does it actually mean to be human? I mean, yeah, you can go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and you sit in that reality. Is it kind of what Henry Van Til talks about, which is to build culture? Like, is that what the human responsibility, like the human telos is to extend Eden into the world? I mean, how would you, for the person listening again, who's caught themselves in this narrative, it's true. What is my purpose? What does it actually mean to be human? I can go to AI for a counselor nowadays. I can talk to them, and AI can actually empathize with me in some ways by expressing sorrow and grief and how sorry they are that you're feeling something. So I think as we kind of close this up, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the AI thing, because I've spoken to some philosophers and futurists who've even put out the possibility that maybe, you know, it's just part of the natural cycle of evolution that we will give way to transhuman, you know, machines that will one day rule the galaxy, and, you know, biological humans will be long dead and forgotten. And I always think that's a kind of absolutely depressing idea, because what you're giving way to is a kind of just mindless automation, essentially. Because I genuinely believe that what is absolutely unique about humans is our ability to love and be loved. AI cannot love you. AI can do a fantastic job at pretending to love you. But that AI is not having any emotions. AI is just ones and zeros in the end, doing a fantastic job at replicating what is ultimately a human. What's something that only humans can experience. I think obviously there are other elements of the animal kingdom that can kind of echo that, but there's something about humans that where we are made to love and to be loved, and that is and that is expressed, in the 2 commandments that Jesus said were the first commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. There's something about love, and in John's gospel, God is love. There's something about this idea that is absolutely central to what it means to be human, and that you can only truly experience once you have joined the source of love, who is God, who kind of, and I think so much of what we end up trying to do as humans is trying to find ways of avoiding that, or diluting that, or kind of replacing that love for God and each other with love for other things. There are all kinds of false idols that we end up kind of chasing in life. But ultimately, it's as simple as that for me. It's to love God and love each other. We're made for relationship, and for me, the whole point of being human is to experience that and to find our way back to that.
I think that's great, because even as you're saying that, I'm just thinking of a phrase that's been stuck in my head over the last 4 months, is the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is actually apathy. It's failing to move towards people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the great danger is that we're in a culture which really prizes kind of the ability to do more and productivity and kind of advance for the sake of advance. And I always want to ask, what's it for? What's any of this for in the end?
Onto what?
Towards what, if we succeed in creating some kind of, society which is purely driven by technology and AI, in which we can just sit back and kind of be passive receivers of everything, what will we have achieved in the end? I don't think we will have done anything in the service of actually experiencing love. We will be experiencing something, but it feels like it's kind of a pale imitation of what we're meant to be. And I just feel like a lot of what people call progress these days is like, well, progress towards what? It feels like we're actually wandering away from the purpose of what it means to be human.
It feels like it's just trying to almost alleviate the pressure versus actually thinking, where is this leading to? Man, no, that was really good, honestly. I just really appreciate your thoughtfulness in that. Just how you articulated, and even just the pastoral tone, and just providing those clear examples. And would you mind just closing us off in prayer?
Sure.
And just, again, for the audience listening and people who are genuinely struggling with the questions of what does it mean to be human, and what does my purpose look like? So if you just do that for us, I'd love that.
Well, Father God, we thank you that you are the source of all truth, goodness, beauty, and you are love. And we live in a world where people are looking for those things. They're on the search again. And I believe, as Paul said, you are not far from each one of them. So my prayer is that anybody watching or listening who perhaps finds themselves in that place would turn and look for you, and know that you're close by, and that you are the one in whom we find truth, beauty, goodness, and love. And I just pray that people who are hungry wouldn't be satisfied by anything else than the true God, the true story, the true reality. Amen.
Amen.